ended between the sea and the sky, where fish have 4 eyes. An enchanted place where trees and waves do battle, pulling new land from the tide. A place forever changed by clearing, cultivation, and concrete. Slowly being lost to the same forces that shaped it and made it fertile. But what if I told you that there is a secret power hidden in these waves? Over 250 million tons of liquid land, birthed by the Amazon and captured by mangroves. For ours is the muddiest coast in the world, a natural earth engine powered by sun and sea, generating fish, food, and flood protection. We can harness this engine by combining natural elements and man-made structures, putting nature to work as we rebuild a resilient coast. A place to imagine, plan, and design with nature in mind. Guyana is that place, and now is the time.
And while our current project focuses on the North Brazil Shelf and green grace solutions, including the development of a regional strategy, we recognize the need to break this regional work down country by country and contextualize the program in such a way that it really fits the country's context and the national context. A critical aspect is to ensure we capture the local perspectives and build on existing work to ensure that the work that was done in phase 1 of this effort is incorporated and forms the basis for our current coastal work that's outlined in our Low Carbon Development Strategy 2030. The LCDS, as it's commonly called, sets out Guyana's strategy from our strategy direction until 2030 and is really framed along 4 interlinked objectives: valuing ecosystem services, investment in clean energy and stimulating low carbon growth, protection against climate change and biodiversity loss, and alignment with global climate and biodiversity goals. Climate adaptation is a core component, and green-gray infrastructure is identified as an approach to maintain and improve ecosystem services within the strategy. Strengthening sea defenses is among the highest priorities for us, particularly through mangrove restoration, which is the green aspect, as well as the development and reconstruction of seawalls, which is the gray aspect. For us, if mangroves were to be lost, the damage to the coastal environment in particular could impact up to 90% of the country's livelihoods. And this is evident, as you might have seen in certain aspects of the video. So I'm really happy to be able to share some of these elements with you today as part of this panel discussion, and I thank you.
Thank you. I think it's really impactful for those of us sitting at the COP to be able to see images of what this actually means. So thank you for sharing that. Last, but by no means least, Michelle Meeklum is with WFEO Young Engineers and is the representative of the Future Leaders Working Group on Climate Action. Welcome.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou katoa. Hello, my name is Michelle Meeklum and I am from New Zealand. My background's in civil engineering and I work mainly in stormwater design, but also looking at infrastructure advisory, thinking around climate resilience and adaptation as well. I guess over the previous panel before us, we've heard that, as engineers, we need to put nature first, and we also need to look at mitigation, adaptation, and resilience in all of our projects. And as Savina was speaking, I thought actually we have a great example that's actually featured in the report, and that comes from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, and it's a project that has been done by Kāinga Ora, which is our government organisation for homes and communities. And as part of this project has been the restoration of Awataha stream, the regeneration of it, which has been for the last 60 or 70 years culverted, so in a pipe buried underground. And this area historically experienced a lot of flooding. And since the daylighting of the stream and the restoration and regeneration of it, we actually had some very devastating climate events in New Zealand in January and February earlier this year. And we saw through the stormwater systems and also the daylighting of the stream that these new systems would prove to be invaluable during these weather events, and really just showed how this project contributed to Auckland's climate resilience. I guess just reflecting on a couple of things that have been mentioned so far, I really think that the task for the engineering industry, including young engineers, is to look at meaningful partnerships with our communities, and that is looking at meaningful partnerships with our Indigenous communities. It's also about youth and young people. It's about people with disabilities. It's about women. It's also about encouraging, one of the speakers in the earlier panel talked about looking beyond the engineering industry and thinking about working with ecologists and of course looking beyond just the infrastructure industry to actually have that systems approach. It's also about building the capacity of our young engineers in the right areas and having that nature-first, nature-driven approach to our infrastructure. The other thing I wanted to touch on is actually, there was a lot of discussion around insurance, and the other thing is looking at post-disaster, and a lot of the time the insurance that happens, the insurance industry only allows organisations to rebuild the same. And so when we talk about building back better, we don't want to build back better with just newer materials. We want to make sure that we can build better in terms of being able to include innovative solutions using nature, but also considering adaptation in our infrastructure, so we're not rebuilding the same thing over and over again.
Thank you. So I am in awe of the panel that I'm sitting here, so I'm going to ask questions. So I work for a non-profit, which means that money is always the problem to anything that we come across. But one of the things we're starting to hear here at the COP is we're actually starting to see resources coming towards these types of solutions. We've seen in the US the Inflation Reduction Act, the Loss and Damage Fund here, and other donors and investors becoming more open to these types of solutions. So I wonder a little bit, one, is money still, I'm going to ask the panel, and maybe I'll start with Joe. Is money still the problem? And then if there are resources coming, what are the challenges to actually scaling up and seeing these solutions implemented in a bigger diversity of places and more systematically and regularly?
Yeah, so one keeps hearing all the time, if you talk to the people who have the money, we've got loads of money. The problem that we're missing is bankable projects. And the problem that has been at the heart of why nature-based solutions haven't been accepted is that bankable projects have been understood in terms of assets, not systems. So a bankable project, it tends to be based on a cost-benefit analysis. And the cost tends to be based on what is the capital cost of actually building that piece of infrastructure? And we've got decades and decades and decades of data of how much it costs to build all sorts of different types of infrastructure. But actually the data that's available to cost out nature-based solutions is in its early years. And there needs to be much more sharing of that data in order to get to rapid maturity of what it costs to do nature-based solutions. The other challenge with nature-based solutions, and it was mentioned on the previous panel, is that they tend to involve lots of different parts of nature acting together. You know, we saw in the video this tension between the mangroves and the sea waves. We bid competitively to do a drainage plan for the city of Beijing, one of the largest cities in the world. And we did that based on nature-based solutions. We used satellite technology and artificial intelligence to understand where there was actually nature in the city and where there was nature that could store water or nature that could attenuate water. And so we actually analyzed Beijing and said, which bits of Beijing can work for us? But we then had to piece that together into a business model that actually combined all those disaggregated bits of nature, which is another problem. And we find that too. I mean, there's a project in, repeatedly, we've got a major shift that we've made in our organization of saying that anything to do with nature, and nature is about water, biodiversity, oceans, air, and land, we need to think of it in terms of if it's by the sea, the coastline, and if it's internal, in terms of the catchment. And that is what I think in the title refers to the whole systems thinking. We have to look at the catchment scale and recognize that actually that's the critical thing, that catchment. And we have to make sure that everything that happens within that catchment actually helps to preserve nature, and then enhance the ability of nature to provide the services that we're looking for it to provide. Now that's a paradigm shift, because as engineers, we tend to think in terms of the built environment, in terms of individual assets, and we don't zoom out to that kind of bigger picture. And that's a discipline that we have to create. But the money's there. We've just got to be able to we've got to get better at articulating value propositions that mean the people with the money can provide it and be certain that they're going to get that return on investment. And my final point is that return on investment is not just economic. It is really broad, and one of the most exciting things we're seeing in terms of nature-based solutions is the return on investment in terms of the health and well-being of people. And there are a few projects now where people are actually beginning to measure that by introducing nature-based solutions rather than a traditional engineered structure, you're creating places where people can enjoy the environment, they can take physical exercise, and that actually translates into health outcomes. And there is a benefit to that in terms of value, so it adds to the business case because it's avoided costs of healthcare.
If I can add, well, yesterday I was telling someone before, I was on a panel at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. I was the only engineer on the panel, together with the investors, also the only woman on the panel with those investors. And I think what Joe's just said is exactly right. I tried to explain and articulate, the value of the solutions, and that goes beyond the monetary value, the traditional cost-benefit analysis. But I think there is more education to be done with those stakeholders, and this is absolutely something that we need to be doing as a profession to try and have those conversations with investors, because. Yes, the money is there, but it's not landing this message yet with those investors and pension funds. I mean, if you think about pension funds investing in projects that have social returns, makes sense, right? You invest back in the community, and then the community, and there are people still paying for their pension, contributing to the funds. That makes sense, but I haven't heard one of those investors make that argument yet.
So we have a target audience. Michelle, do you feel like it's a communications problem, or do you feel like there's something else getting in the way of accessing the resources that seem to be becoming available?
So by resources, do you mean financing? Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So we think that there appears to be emerging resources for these green infrastructure, hybrid green-grey solutions, but it doesn't seem as though we're getting access to those resources yet. You come from hopefully the transition in the culture of the engineering community, which seems to be happening, but Savina is telling us that there are other communities that we need to bring along. What from your perspective, is there anything getting in the way of accessing those resources?
Yeah, I think part of it is the policy situation, and that makes it difficult for and the communication, as you're saying, and reaching the communities that actually do need it, particularly the marginalised communities when we're thinking about those in rural areas, Indigenous communities, women, young people, and making sure that we have those systems in place to enable them to actually know how to access these resources, but not just how to access, but the application towards it and the processes. There's a lot of boxes that people need to tick, and often there's the misunderstanding of how to access and go through the process of getting funding for projects.
So I think that brings up an interesting question, which is that projects don't live in isolation, that they are dependent upon not just financing, but the policy and regulatory spaces that they exist in. And there's a sort of, this is another component or another lens on this idea of holistic approaches to implementing these approaches to engineering. Priya, in the work that you've done in Guyana, are there sort of, how have you approached this sort of holistic solutions?
I mean, in our context, we're still learning. It's a learning process, really. And for us, green-grey solutions or nature-based solution is still fairly new. We're lucky that we have sort of an overarching policy perspective or direction that allows for this, and this is only within the last year and a half or so that really helps to frame our perspective as it relates to adaptation and how we secure our coastal, or how we plan for coastal resilience. While that's there, the challenge, though, is really being able to frame those projects, but ensuring that those projects, and I think this was mentioned in the previous panel, that they're contextualized. For us, it's a huge there's a huge social dimension to this, there's a social element, and so many of the solutions need to be able to be framed from the ground up. And a few of the panelists previously touched on this element, really, to ensure that solutions aren't designed very external to where they're needed. We actually need to work and collaborate with the partners on the ground, especially communities, to be able to design and build them for where they're needed and the spaces that they're needed. And so again, it also comes to a little bit of a behavioral change. So even though a policy framework is there is need for behavioral change, especially in the areas for the decision makers that are really going to be driving this process, but those on the ground as well, in terms of is it adequate? Does it really address the current issue, and whether those in the design process have the capability to be able to do that?
I'm wondering, Merkebe, with your experience, have you got any other examples of these sort of holistic integrated solutions that we can sort of use?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, we are not achieving most of the climate targets globally. So my view is we keep trying the same traditional approach to cut down emission. So we need a holistic approach that integrates finance and policies, but most importantly, in my view, we need system transition. So if we are serious about a net zero GHG emission by 2050, we shouldn't allow these large systems or sectors to continue operating the same way. We have to change the way we produce electricity. We have to change the way we move people and freight, or we have to change the way we build our city, we maintain our city, and also we operate our city. So if we are thinking about this change, we have to not only applying a system approach, we have to think about transitioning systems into a new low carbon economic arrangements. How do we do that? We have done this in the past. We have seen a lot of systems transitioned. For example, we have transportation system transition from a cart-drawn vehicle to internal combustion engine. We have seen the digital era. The way we operate right now is not similar to the way we operate 10, 20 years ago. So for every system to transition, basically we have 3 stages. We have system emerge, then we have large-scale deployment and system reconfiguration. So in my research group, we develop a framework or a tool that will help nations or big organizations to evaluate their strategies that will allow them to accelerate the path to a net zero economic arrangement. So for each transition stage, we can subscribe policy options. Then, for example, if a technology or nature-based solution is at emergence stage, obviously we need research and development. If the technology or any type of pathway element or a strategy that will help us to accelerate this net zero transition, if it is in a large-scale deployment, we might need intervention from federal governments. Then later, if it is in reconfiguration stage, we have to come up and say, for example, phasing out of fossil fuels. Incumbent technologies, we need intervention from federal governments. This has been done in the past. So at each transition stage, we have to subscribe different mix of policies that will accelerate those kind of process. It's a system level approach, but later we have to also design evaluation criteria for these pathway elements. This evaluation criteria could be each of these solutions, they have to be mature, whether they are at the lab or if they have been out in the real world, or we have to see whether they are cost effective against existing strategies. The second one would be whether they are ready, these options, whether they are ready to meet our net zero economic arrangements. And later, we have to also evaluate whether these pathway elements are interesting for key stakeholders who would be developing them and deploying them on a large scale level.
Can I add something here? I think something that is also really important is looking at collaborative approaches to public procurement, well, all procurement, but I guess in public procurement. Earlier today I went to an event and they were talking about the Green Public Procurement Pledge, but that is specifically around materials. So I guess as I was sitting in there, I was thinking, well, why can't we have something that actually drives more nature in our infrastructure projects as well? And also, as my colleague presented yesterday in the Concrete Futures Pavilion about different types of procurement, such as alliance modelling for high-risk, high-cost projects as a way to actually drive innovation, drive sustainability in projects, and that's something different from traditional procurement models, but that's something that can really drive from the policy, but the finance side of things in terms of how we get nature as a priority in our projects.
So that, I think, brings up one last thing I wanted to touch on, which was the role of government. Here we are at the UNFCCC. It's a government-run process. What should we be bringing to our various governments here in Dubai, but then also when we all go home, as being critical to opening up these solutions? So I'm going to start at this end with Joe.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that even though, like, my firm, Arab, is a fairly large firm of about 20,000 people, even an organisation like us can't influence government. Not very much. Because we're seen as the private sector. We're seen as one voice. And if we go and talk to government, they then feel that they have to talk to 6 or 7 or 8 other organisations to make sure they're not being biased by us. And other times it's a conflict of interest for them, etc. So bilateral conversations with government are quite tricky. And the NGO community are much better at operating collectively and creating a collective voice to be heard by government. The engineering leadership group, which was introduced by Sue in the last part of the panel, is an effort to actually bring together a number of organisations so that we can create that collective voice. And it emerged out of an ask from the G7, from the G20. We're making difficult decisions at government. At events like COP, we're making difficult decisions. We've got to be able to implement those decisions. And so they need to be able to tap into the organisations who are experts in nature-based solutions or experts in energy infrastructure to be able to understand whether what the policies that they're creating are actually implementable. So I think we all need to think harder about how we can lean in and collaborate with our peers and collaborate with people who do different things. We have a relationship with Conservation International because my organisation doesn't know huge amounts about nature. We're learning, but we want to learn from people, who are the experts, and I think that's really important. But I think the best way to influence governments is actually locally, and I'm a great believer in place-based solutions that are co-created with the community. And to make that really tangible, I just want to share with you a couple of things that we've been doing. One in Bhutan, and I really recommend you go to the Bhutan Pavilion. It's the most magical country. We've been working collaboratively with them now for about 4 or 5 years. We're developing the Thimphu master plan, but we said, let's start with nature. Bhutan's greatest asset is nature. It's one of the only nature-positive, carbon negative, I have to get it the right way around, countries in the world because it's got so much forest, and it doesn't want to lose that position. And so we're working with them to help them develop a new master plan for their city that starts with nature. Instead of starting with shopping malls and roads, which is how Dubai was created, how many cities in Africa are going down that route, it started with what's the hydrology, what's the topography, what's the ecology, what's the geomorphology? And actually saying, we have this incredible asset called nature. Let's make that the foundation of the master plan.
Sorry for the interruption, but just a kind reminder that we have only 5 minutes left for the session.
Okay. I'll stop to give someone else a voice.
All right, I don't know. Savina, have you got any last words to share with us?
Maybe just to build on what Joe was saying, I think in our kind of toolkit, we need to just start painting or making policymakers visualize what it is that they can achieve through the solution, and we already have this type of holistic solutions, and make them politically appealing. I think that's how you really influence the policymakers. You make them want to implement the solutions that we're proposing.
Last words?
I just want to say that I guess when we think about the next generation of nature-based engineers, as you say, we need to start now, and so that could look like bringing school groups to your nature projects. Is about encouraging school kids to actually consider a career in STEM, and that actually a career in STEM also involves nature as well. And when you think about engineering, engineering is not just about concrete structures, it's also about nature as well. So we need to think about the next generation.
I think from our perspective, the technical elements are important, the science are important. We were until now we have been able to, we've been missing actually engineering guidance. We've been missing conceptual designs and how those really are applicable on the ground. And with us working with the Deltaris group out of the Netherlands, we've been able to really bring a lot of perspectives on the ground and understanding the mud dynamics along the coast. We've also developed the mud bank and coastal change monitoring protocol, and these are really shared with our decision makers. We've developed the first ever green-gray engineering guidance on our coast, and when Emily presented first, you might have seen some photos up there. We've also been able to provide recommendations to the ministry to incorporate green-gray solutions in long-term planning and determine those priority areas. So I really believe that real practical, technical, and science-based information are very key to the process.
Thank you. And Merkebe, very quickly, any last words?
Yeah, so I would like to invite the audience to check the University of Calgary website. We do a lot of activities in sustainability fields. We have a lot of research in terms of nature-based solution, biomimicry, and thank you for attending.
So I'd like to close by thanking our co-organisers. My one little observation is the panel looks very different than it would have when I went through engineering school many, many years ago. And I think that change is to be celebrated, but I think it's also an indication that the engineering community is moving along in many different ways. So that makes me very joyous. So thank you very much, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you.